HMS Broke was a large destroyer known as a flotilla leader, part of the Dover Patrol for the latter half of the First War. I actually want to tell the story of the ship and of two of her crew, her captain, Commander Edgar Evans, and able seaman Joe Bagnall. They were involved in the Battle of the Dover Strait in April 17, when HMS Broke and fellow flotilla leader HMS Swift engaged 6 German destroyers, which were bombarding the German coast in a night raid. The ensuing battle defined these two lives. Evans went on to a distinguished naval career, but was forever known as Evans of the Broke. Joe Bagnall was killed in the action, aged 21. The story is deeply personal because he was my great-uncle, my grandmother's only brother. Broke was one of 6 Faulkner-class flotilla leaders, built for the Chilean Navy by J. Samuel White and Sons on the Isle of Wight. They were part of a destroyer arms race in South America. The Chileans wanted the larger ships to keep up with those being built for Brazil and Argentina. At the outbreak of war, 4 of the ships had not been delivered, and they were requisitioned by the Admiralty to become the Faulkner class. You'll notice the Chilean flag on the stern of the soon-to-become HMS Faulkner at launch. Here is a comparison of the British Tribal class destroyers and the German V-25 class. It illustrates what distinguished a flotilla leader from a regular destroyer. They were substantially larger, with more crew and heavier armament. Mohawk was commanded by Evans when he was first assigned to the Dover Patrol in 1914. At that point, the tribals made up a significant part of the Dover force. SMS G42 was involved in the 1917 action. Evans commented that the 4 forward-facing guns gave Broke a significant advantage in firepower. Another consequence of the Chilean design was, again to quote Evans, "beautiful accommodation for the captain and rotten quarters for everyone else." The original builder's plans are held at the National Maritime Museum. I was able to handle the originals and to obtain a digital copy of this general arrangement drawing. I'm very pleased to confirm that Alex, who spoke last month, and his colleagues in the plans department provide a welcoming and most helpful service. Between the blue lines, you can see that well over half of the volume of the ship is taken up by the 6 boilers plus turbines that gave her around 30 knots of coal-fired speed. The red ovals pick out the 4 forward-facing guns, giving her the enhanced firepower. In addition, there were 2 aft guns in red and 4 torpedo tubes in green, making up the main armament. Post-requisition, Broke was assigned to Scapa Flow as part of the 2nd Destroyer Flotilla. At Jutland, that was in 1916, she was second in command of the 4th Destroyer Flotilla. Several German cruisers were engaged, and Broke's sister ship Tipperary, the flotilla leader, was lost. A little later, Broke was caught in the lights of SMS Westphalen, a Nassau-class dreadnought. The destroyer was simply overmatched. In about 45 seconds, Westphalen fired 13 15cm and 13 8.88cm shells before turning away. The effect on Broke was devastating. Amongst the extensive damage, the steering was jammed to starboard and the engine room telegraph disabled. Uncontrollable and turning hard to starboard, she rammed HMS Sparrowhawk, which then sank. Broke was barely saved and limped home. Of her crew of 200, over 80 were either killed or wounded. The ship was repaired in Tyneside. Able seaman Bagnall joined her in the August. Commander Evans took control in the December and sailed her south to reinforce the Dover patrol. Edward Evans was born in London in 1880. Although not from a naval background, from a young age he was determined to pursue a seagoing career. Initially rebuffed by the Royal Navy, Evans instead started training for the Merchant Navy. He then achieved a Royal Navy cadetship and joined as a midshipman. Evans met Scott while serving on HMS Majestic and was seconded to the relief ship for Scott and Shackleton's first polar expedition in 1902. That experience led to Scott appointing him as second in command of the 1911 expedition and as captain of the expedition ship Terra Nova. In passing, you may have noticed that fresh images of the wreck of Terra Nova were released in this past summer. Evans was integral to the expedition. He was one of the last to see Scott alive when they parted for Scott to make the final push to the pole. After many weeks on the ice, Evans' health broke down and he was heroically nursed back to his base by colleagues in February 1912. He recovered and commanded the Terra Nova when she brought back the remnant of the expedition in 1913. Evans returned to the regular Navy and at the outbreak of war commanded HMS Mohawk, one of 12 tribal destroyers assigned to the Dover Patrol. Joe Watson Bagnall was born into a farming family in Hawley, Oxfordshire. We're not sure of the motivation, but he joined the Navy as a boy second class, aged 16. 2 years later, he signed on as an ordinary seaman for 12 years service. That was in January 14. He was initially assigned to HMS Achilles, a Warrior-class cruiser based at Scapa Flow, and he was promoted to able seaman in February 15. After Achilles, he spent an extended period at the gunnery school HMS Excellent near Portsmouth. He joined Broke at Scapa Flow after her repairs post-Jutland, and under Evans sailed south to Dover in December 16. We have a few snippets from Joe's naval life, a diary extract from his time on Achilles, some training notes from Whale Island, and a few letters home. The one from Broke to my grandmother rather charmingly says, "Thank you so much for the walnuts." The picture is with his parents on the steps of the family home, and the leave ticket is probably his last leave before the action. So what was the purpose of the Dover Patrol, which Broke had joined with Evans and Bagnall aboard? Jellicoe expressed it very succinctly: render the Straits of Dover impassable for enemy ships of all kinds. It was a critical and complex role in a key location. In 1917, 80 to 100 ships were passing through the channel each day: merchant ships, troop ships, hospital ships. The Dover Patrol was charged with protecting this critical traffic, while also placing and maintaining mines and barrages, clearing enemy mines, deterring submarines, carrying out coastal bombardments, and deterring night raids. The resources committed were principally the 6th Flotilla, comprising destroyers and torpedo boats, supplemented by flotilla leaders, monitors, P-boats, coastal motorboats. There were also over 200 drifters, trawlers, and launches in the command, each with vital tasks but vulnerable to attack. The key strategic challenge and risk was that as defender, the Dover patrol was inevitably spread across the patrol area, while the potential attackers could choose their moment and focus their forces on a particular point of attack. Jellicoe, who was First Sea Lord from November 16, and Vice Admiral Bacon, in charge of the Dover Patrol, were acutely aware of this risk. To quote Jellicoe again, "A great deal depended upon the work of these destroyers. They formed the principal, indeed practically the only protection for the vast volume of trade passing the Straits of Dover." The map gives an indication of the complexity of the web of mines and net barrages that have been put in place. The area off Deal, the Downs, was a critical anchorage where ships were stopped for inspection. Of 100,000 ships that passed through the Downs in 1915 to 17, only one was lost. After Jutland in mid-16, some of the focus of German naval operations switched to the Channel, with Ostend and Zeebrugge under German control. At least 15 destroyers were permanently located at the Belgian bases. Indeed, Jellicoe said that there were 22 or more at one stage. On the 27th of October 1916, in a night raid by a full flotilla, HMS Flirt was sunk and HMS Nubian lost her bow to a torpedo. The stern of Nubian was notably eventually mated with the forward part of HMS Zulu to become HMS Zubian. During another raid on the 18th of March 17, HMS Peregrine was torpedoed and sunk, and there were no German losses. So by April 17, there had been a lack of definitive response to the night attacks. Each raid on the Kentish coast had a disproportionately negative effect on home morale. On the night of 20th of April, 2 half flotillas set out from Belgium to raid the English and French coasts. The Z half flotilla headed towards Calais, opened sporadic fire just after 11 p.m, then retreated and nothing more was heard from them. The 5th half flotilla headed for Dover. The trawler Sabreur engaged about 3 miles off Dover and was badly hit. The raiders then fired somewhat wildly towards Dover and the anchorage at the Downs. Broke and Swift investigated, but didn't locate them and returned to their patrol area to protect the Downs ships. An hour and a half later, they again headed towards the gunfire, and this time located the 5th half flotilla, 6 destroyers, headed for home. The 6 German destroyers were in line formation, as were Broke and Swift. The 2 lines approached port to port. Admiral Bacon's diagram gives the clearest illustration of the action. Of course, it was all happening at night. Keeping track was difficult, to say the least. The Germans thought they were up against several light cruisers, and at one point those on Broke's Bridge thought they were fighting 15 ships. Swift and Broke approached and engaged. Both fired torpedoes at SMS G85, which was hit and started to sink. Both sides opened fire. Broke was hit. Sadly, Joe Bagnall was fatally wounded by the first shelter strike, almost certainly running towards his action station on a starboard forward gun. Broke then rammed G42 while both ships were at high speed. In the circumstances, at night, it was a remarkable feat of seamanship. Swift tried the same and missed, partly blinded by her own gun flashes. For a brief period, there was hand-to-hand fighting on the foredeck of Broke. The main damage to Broke seems to have been while she was enmeshed with G42. Evans recounts a litany of damage from at least 7 separate shell strikes, each of which hit a different part of the ship, causing casualties and damage. The third of these, and I quote, is one shell on the forecastle which struck our own shell in the rack and exploded too. Unfortunately, this caused a great number of casualties amongst the gun crews there. This was probably the shell which killed Uncle Joe. Broke managed to disengage from G42, and both she and Swift attempted to pursue the remaining raiders. They didn't catch them. Having lost the main steam pipe, Broke literally ran out of steam and had to await a tow back to Dover. This is an artist's impression of the ramming which appeared in the press, and another from a different angle. These are clippings from Evans' personal papers and illustrations of the fight on the foredeck. The swords and cutlasses are not an exaggeration. Both were kept within reach on Broke and were used in the fight. Broke and Swift returned to Dover to a hero's welcome. The final losses on Broke were 21 killed and 27 wounded. Swift escaped much more lightly. The majority of the German crews have been rescued, and the action made the national press. Good news was very welcome at the time, and it was widely reported, as seen in the examples just shown. Both skippers were immediately promoted to captain, and there were multiple awards and mentions in dispatches for various crew members. There was a flurry of congratulatory telegrams from around the world. In Evans' papers are ones from the King, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, and from the branch of the Navy League in Winnipeg, Canada. More somberly, there was also tangible appreciation on the streets of Dover. In Evans' words, our own brave dead were buried the following day when all Dover turned out to pay their last mark of respect to our fallen sailors. Without doubt, it had been a victory and a boost to home morale. Jellicoe's assessment gives an indication of the strategic deterrent impact. I'll quote in full. The enemy was taught a lesson which resulted in his displaying even greater caution in laying his plans and evincing a greater respect for the Dover force for many months. Broke was taken to London for repair. First Sea Lord Admiral Jellicoe and the King were among visitors to inspect the damage. You have the King's telegraph on the left and the King inspecting a ventilator cowl on the right. The cowl gives a graphic illustration of the damage that the ship suffered in the engagement. By the summer of 17, Broke was repaired and back to regular duties under the newly promoted Captain Evans. This is some contemporary footage shot in the summer of 17 during a raid to bombard the Belgian coast. HMS Swift. Probably HMS North Star, an M-class destroyer and noticeably smaller. And this is either Broke or one of her sister ships. It's very hard to tell. That's Evans on the bridge. French Admiral Ronnac was spoken of very highly by both Bacon and Evans. So that's some footage which I found quite remarkable to come across in researching this. It really does reach back into the history. So after the repair, Broke quickly returns to the flotilla. Duties included acting as a taxi service to VIPs crossing the Channel. Notable passengers included Churchill and Lloyd George. In September 17, US Admiral Mayo joined Admirals Jellicoe and Bacon to observe a bombardment in Ostend. This was the first occasion of a US admiral being under fire on a British man-of-war. The picture is of Broke taking the King and others to France shortly after the armistice. In May 1920, she was finally delivered to the Chilean Navy after a slight delay and some use by one careful owner. She entered service with them as Almirante Uribe and was active until 1933. Evans went on to a distinguished naval career. He ended the war commanding HMS Active on convoys to the Mediterranean. Promotions and postings followed to the Far East, Australia, and Africa. In 1945, he was ennobled as Baron Mount Evans of Chelsea. Mount Evans derives from Mount Evans in Antarctica, named after him by Scott in their first expedition. Despite the title as first Baron Mount Evans, he was still widely known as Evans of the Broke. A number of the crew were buried in Dover, but Joe went home to Hawley, where his name appears on the village war memorial. The letter from Joe's shipmate, Arthur Grigg, to my great-grandparents was a treasure to find. His description of my chum, the only one, is very touching. He relates Joe as having been killed by the first shell while running to his gun. There is a permanent memorial to the Dover Patrol on the cliffs above Dover. Another one of the same design at Cap Blanc-Nez near Calais. And unexpectedly, a third in John Paul Jones Park in Brooklyn, New York. Uncle Joe and the fellow members of the Dover Patrol are gone, but definitely not forgotten. That brings talk to an end. I hope you found it of interest. Thank you.